You're listening to the Tony Steuer Podcast, where Tony interviews financial literacy advocates who are changing the conversation on money, so you can catch up on the latest trends and ideas in the world of financial literacy and education.
Welcome to the Tony Steuer Podcast. I'm pleased to be joined today by Julie Rains. Julie is the author of Growing Wealth. In this episode, we'll be discussing where gardening and money meet. Julie, welcome to the Tony Steuer Podcast.
Thank you, Tony. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Excited to get in this conversation. Loved your book. As we get started, tell us a little bit, what is your origin story? How did you get started in financial wellness?
Well, I like to think I have two sides of my origin story. The first is what kind of came natural to me as a child. I was a natural saver, and I seemed to have an affinity for numbers. I don't think I realized that was unusual as a child. The way I kind of expressed that affinity was a lot of times through money. And my parents were children in the Great Depression, so they really passed down this idea of frugality and saving and being cautious, and that really reinforced this whole idea of saving. And I won't say I think it gave me consciousness about finance. I'm not sure if that was really wellness, but it was definitely a consciousness about finance. And even as a child, I think in elementary school, I learned about compound interest and exponential growth, and that was really fascinating. And that might be unusual for like an 8-year-old to get excited about that, but I was. But the second phase was really when I was an adult and had a child and started seeing how they learned. And I learned that the way I learned was profoundly different than other people. And I knew that I wasn't that great at doing things. I had somebody had to tell me like exactly what to do. Like it was saying gardening, I couldn't just look at somebody planting something and figure out what they were doing, or even I guess whatever I learned in biology class kind of went over my head. So I wasn't very good at doing things. I wasn't good at geometry. Like the other math thing that I couldn't do was geometry. I wasn't very visual spatial. So what I learned from this process of I went through an evaluation and learned that how differently I looked at the world. And probably the thing I took away at first was that I needed very explicit instruction to learn something. I needed somebody to teach me gardening. I went back and took some graduate classes in writing. So I learned that. I think later I really came to understand that I had this strength in money. So those two things kind of came together a little bit later in life for me. But I had always been using the money for financial and financial wellness. But once I learned gardening, it kind of broadened my ability to understand the world and also relate how hard, even though money came easy to me, other things didn't, especially gardening. And so I had a little bit more empathy and understanding what other people would go through when they were trying to learn something.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think that's missed a lot by the financial services industry, is that, you need a little bit of empathy. It came up in a LinkedIn conversation, about that we need to talk human when we talk about money and instead of money terms. And, I think that's part of what, I don't want to bury the lead here with what we're talking about with your book, but I love that connection that you made between gardening and money. So, let's get into that. What inspired you to write Growing Wealth?
Well, I think the initial inspiration was that I knew that money was confusing, and I knew that people are sometimes going to use misleading terms to get people to buy things, sometimes in a service of trying to help them, sometimes in order to maybe not help them, but just to make a commission. But so I knew that things could be confusing, and I wanted to write something that was more clear. And then I also wanted to open up more conversations for people by telling stories. The thing about the gardening kind of came in a little bit later. That's when I realized that that's a good kind of won't say hook. People describe it as a hook. To me, it's more like metaphors describing what I learned in one area and how I can relate it to another.
Yeah, well, let's go a little bit deeper on that. How did that connection come about? How did you make the connection between gardening and money?
I won't say that I did make the connection. I started writing about it, and I noticed that people started they weren't excited when I wrote about my regular financial stuff. Some people weren't, but people were more interested when I started talking about gardening. It seemed to be more relatable. And I think in hindsight, I realized that I probably explained ideas more concretely and more simply that way. Doesn't mean they were all simple concepts, but I think I was able to explain things in a better way, and it was more engaging. So I just kind of kept writing that and started thinking more and more about ways gardening can relate to growing wealth.
Well, and I think that's important is, that people need to be able to relate and understand is, as we were talking about a minute ago, is we use a lot of terms in the financial world that people don't really understand or are familiar with.
Mhm.
But, we know simple gardening terms. We've all learned, maybe we don't know the basics or know how to grow a garden, but we know, planting and, tilling the soil and all the other terms. And so, I think we have a point of reference where for money, if I ask you, like, what's the coupon rate on your bond, you're probably going to go, what?
Yeah.
You don't have a
Right.
point of reference for that. It
Right.
doesn't
That's
come up
true.
in conversation much.
Right.
So I love that because I think that's how people learn is, when they can say, okay, well, I get this, I understand this, and I can make, I guess, a connection like you did to something.
Right.
And if it's something that is enjoyable, like gardening, then it makes it easier to understand because we're open to it. So, as you went through gardening, I mean, it's a hobby, so you enjoy it, right?
Right. And I think there's a lot of maybe the taboo or fear around money. My fear was around gardening, but I think there's not as much fear about it. It's more something that you enjoy and something that you're outside and you're planting. People say that's very therapeutic for them to go out and dig in the dirt and to see things grow, and it's very nurturing. I find it therapeutic to do a spreadsheet, but um, somebody else,
Yeah,
a lot of people would think more in terms of being outside and growing things and seeing things kind of come to fruition.
definitely. I don't think I've heard anybody ever say that spreadsheets are therapeutic before, but that's good. That's good. The accountants in the audience are going to be really happy to hear that. So it's great. But I think you said something that's super important is about the fear of money.
Mhm.
And I think that is one reason why people just don't deal with their finances. I mean, would you agree that you feel that people have fear when it comes to talking about their money and dealing with their money?
Definitely. I mean, it can be very intimidating. And I think it can be intimidating. It can be scary if you don't understand the terms. If you're worried you don't can't make a bill, pay a bill or something, that can be really scary. And just talking and dealing with people sometimes, not always. Some people, at your local bank are great and very helpful, and then sometimes they're not as helpful. So like any other human interaction, it can be positive and negative. But I think people maybe sort of tend to look at the negative and get a little frustrated and fearful of that. That's true.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the other thing you point out too is, the taboo nature of talking about money is, I think that's also a factor.
I think you're right, and I think I'd like one of the things I hope with the book. Well, I wrote a book, as you mentioned earlier, is that the idea of sharing your stories would become more commonplace. Just like you might swap stories about, what do I do about these leaves on my peach tree that are brown. You might ask a friend that. You might just be just as comfortable asking a friend. Um, Somebody asked recently about a health insurance, where is a broker that I can work with, so that you become a little more comfortable. Or this is how I'm, finance my mortgage, or whatever the topic is. Not that you have to reveal all your secrets, but just to have a normal conversation about some of those things. It's amazing how much you can learn just from normal conversations. And I also will say, I've learned a lot from my parents, and then learned a lot from my kids, like different generations, to kind of see the different stories. And sometimes you'll see similar things, but also things change. The economy changes over time too. So just to make that more of a normal conversation.
100%. Yeah, I think that's part of it too, is, as you say, is it's not something sometimes that you can talk about comfortably with other people, or sometimes people think they're giving away a secret, as you mentioned. or they're just not as open because like, what do I say? That's personal. Can I talk about my 401k without saying what my balance is? I mean, where do you draw that line between it being personal and not personal? Because if you're talking about your garden, it's like, you're not going to say, well, I can't tell you if I planted peas or not. That's kind of proprietary information. So I love that.
Yeah, and I think you probably would do whatever you feel comfortable as far as sharing, but I think and even like for me, it might be more family, definitely with some friends if I'd need some advice or see maybe what other people have done, but it can be really helpful, I think, within families as well.
Yeah. And, I've even seen that in families is, the couples don't talk about it, or, adult parents don't want to talk to their kids, about it because, it's none of their business, they don't need to know that. And then you have this whole communication thing going on because people just are not open with their money. And it's hard to have a good communication when you can't talk about half the things in the room.
Right. And I think about my dad would tell me, he didn't sit me down and talk to me about things, but just conversations over the years just kind of helped me understand, what he did and what he did right. He said, for example, he'd say, Julie, you need to say more than I did. And that just kind of said, okay, I get it. That there's something, in his era was not, 401ks weren't invented or IRAs weren't invented, and buying stocks was very expensive. So there's also some context there. But he also explained to me about, mortgages and things like that. So that was just some of those brief conversations really helped me get some context for his finances and how I could run mine.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point for everybody, watching and listening to this is, talk to your kids about this. Is, as Julie said, you can provide your kids with context. You may not be able to answer all the questions for them, but, have the conversations with your kid, help them learn personal finance early. So, let's go back to your book for a minute. You cover 3 essentials in the book. Can you tell us briefly, what are the 3 essentials?
Well, I've got the thing that kind of inspired that framework was the 3 essentials that my gardening teacher told me. And she said, and this really helped me because I had tried before and wasn't very successful. But she said, the 3 essentials are good dirt, sun, and water. And she said, nothing else matters if you don't have good dirt. And that really stuck with me. I only took 1 class from this person. People think this is like a coach that I had for years, but it's like, no, just 1 class. But she said those 3 things, and that made a huge difference. And so when I started thinking about growing wealth and personal finance, there's so much to learn. But I thought, well, if I can distill that into 3 essentials, I would say there's spending less than you earn, making money in ways that don't require daily work, and protecting yourself from loss. And if nothing else matters, if you can't learn how to spend less than you earn. So that framework really carried over well for me. I felt like it did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's great. And also, I think, I mean, that's where we met is, in talking about risk protection is why do you think sometimes people don't consider that one of the essentials, that it doesn't get talked about as much?
That's interesting that you asked that, because I just, it's so, again, it's sort of natural to me that would be essential. I think part of it might be when I start that they might fear some fear or pressure with, not from you, because that's the thing that I bond, I think, over you is very unbiased and focused on educating about insurance. But I think there's a little bit of a fear about insurance. People might feel like they're pressured, so maybe they ignore that. I'm not sure exactly. I had a little bit more of an insight into protection because of my background, maybe a little bit of natural risk averseness, but parents growing into depression, there was actually something they needed to protect themselves from as far as economic collapse. So that might have been something that was kind of instilled in me as far as protection. But I think that can be scary. But I don't think protection isn't just about insurance. That's a big component of it. And if you can find somebody that's really good insurance, just hold on to them and grab them, because that's really that's something that's very valuable.
Yeah, well, that's I mean, that's my core thing is that insurance forms, I think, the foundation of our financial house, and it protects us. But I think there's, as you point out, it's not just the typical insurance that we tend to think of is, like people call it an emergency fund. I like the term rainy day fund a little bit better, but I think that's, that's insurance. Because you're protecting yourself against having big car repairs. And so I like that you're, stretching the meaning where it's not just insurance. It's about taking care of, I guess having a plan B if you need it.
Right. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of an emergency fund. I think about this as far as savings, but you're right. Having that, if something happens, what are you going to do? And so how do you build up, reserves or whatever it is to protect yourself because something's going to happen.
Yeah, no, right. But as you said, savings account is the same thing. So since we're talking about savings, I know that you talk about compound interest, and it's one of the things that I think is such an important concept for people. So why do you feel that understanding compound interest is so powerful?
I think for me, it was, and for most people would be just that it encourages you to start investing early and staying invested and then being able to enjoy that wealth later or whenever you need it. I think, and that's what, like I said, when I learned it fairly early, so I could make money decisions in the lens of, this dollar now that I want to spend on something versus, a lot of dollars in the future. So I seem to have that a little bit more intuitive decision making. And I think that could help people make decisions that you're not just giving up $1 now or saving $1 now. You're also giving up all that compound growth. And I'll insert here, I still think of that as a kind of it's a very important concept, but kind of a difficult concept. And I don't know if you are the same as I was when I was a kid, where there's a teacher that talks about, you have a penny, and each day it doubles, for a whole month. And you wouldn't think, so you have a penny, and then the next day it's, worth 2 cents. Like, great, wow, great. The next day it's worth 4 cents. Wow, that's great. It's like, that's not that big of a deal. But then if you keep going, it's like $10 million, like at the end of the month. And that doesn't, I still want to say, is that right? I want to go get my spreadsheet out to make sure that that's right. Because it's so, when I model it, that's one of the reasons I like spreadsheets. I like to model how things work. It's very concrete. If I can see it on the paper, it's more concrete to me. I guess that's a better way of saying it. And I would encourage anybody to go out and just kind of model what, that concept. Because I think on paper, to me, it seems more real.
Yeah, and I've heard some other examples of compound interest, like I think, with a pond, getting lily pads covered, like that only half the pond is covered, 28 days into the month, but, it's like the last day where the last half gets covered because that's the last compounding component. And I think that's the part that's hard for us to understand is that,
yes,
that's where the magic of compound interest happens, is just in that very last part, that it's not in the early part.
That's a great, I think I've heard that before, but I hadn't really thought about it that well. That's a good example.
Yeah, I think that was from Morgan Housel. I may not be pronouncing his last name correctly, but I think that was his example. So, one of the things I want to make sure that we talked about is, compassion. And I think that's so important, is that, as we talked about earlier, that it's beyond the numbers. So why is it important for people to be compassionate with themselves?
Compassion. Well, I think that it can help. I think in general, it's a good idea to be compassionate, but I think especially with money or anything you're learning, that if you aren't compassionate with yourself, and because I've experienced this, then you kind of get stuck. You think, you think you're the problem, and you don't think maybe there's a solution to the problem. You just feel like you're kind of stuck, and you don't really want to tell anybody about it, and you fear you're going to be shamed about it. And so I think if you're compassionate with yourself, it kind of opens you up to learning. It opens you up to, finding resources that you need to learn. Um, and that, and I think when you're compassionate yourself, it's a little bit, it's easier to be compassionate with other people. So if you're teaching somebody, whether it's about gardening or money, you can be more compassionate with them and have more empathy with them and really help people navigate questions or topics or things that problems they're trying to solve. If you're more compassionate with yourself and other people.
Yeah, I think that's so important. It's, especially with money, is because it's so easy to feel bad. It's so easy to feel shamed. Like giving up your daily coffee is, give up your daily coffee. If you're buying coffee at Starbucks, you're a bad person and you're not going to be able to retire. I mean, how do you feel about that? How do you address that when you talk about it?
Well, it's funny you should say, because I'm not a coffee person. I don't understand the whole coffee craze. So, but you make a good point in that, sometimes we focus on the wrong things. I mean, to me, the broader message, it's not a terrible message, but the broader message is you need to find a way to spend less than you earn. And it may be that's the one thing you love doing is going to the coffee shop and tipping your barista and hanging out with your friends and getting a good start on the day. But it's like anything else. If you want to make sure you're not spending too much, but I think the idea of if somebody just points that out and you might be doing 100 other things right, and you are spending less. I mean, you're earning more than you're spending, then that doesn't really help you, make any progress. So I think you do think about things that are personal, to not feel ashamed of something. And I, that you say that, because I remember somebody saying something about my peach tree, like what maybe it isn't. There's like 100 things I need to think about before it'll grow. And I was so excited about these peach blossoms, and I felt like, here's something else I got to worry about.
It's
it hadn't even happened yet.
Like you say. Well, yeah, and like you said, is that daily coffee may not even make much of a difference to somebody in the long run. That I think you have to, as you point out, is remember the core principle of spending less than you earn. If you have money to buy a daily coffee, and that's what makes your day and makes it so you can go have a good day, then I don't think that's the worst thing for people. That it's personal, and that you meet the three essentials.
Right. And just to reiterate, I hadn't really thought about it being a shaming type thing, but I know people experience that as shaming. And again, I don't necessarily think of the money thing as shaming, but I definitely pick up on the gardening shame.
Gardening shame. I haven't heard that before. We haven't talked about gardening shame before. So Julie, as we wrap up, what's your number one tip on changing the way we think about money?
I think I'll go back to what we talked about before, is sharing stories. It's just being willing to share stories. And one thing that I found when I shared stories, and I think other people will find this, is how much of your how much you've been affected by your parents and your growing up and just the way you see life. And then maybe you even actually have biases when you're giving other people, like if a parent's giving advice to their kid, they might realize, oh, wait a second, I have some biases here that maybe might be a positive influence, they might be a negative influence, or they might be neutral, but just to kind of get to know your own story and then to be able to share stories with other people, because I think that can really help take away some of the shame. And just even inevitably, if you share a story about money, you're going to share a story about making a mistake. And that helps. I think it helps people learn that everybody makes mistakes. And that doesn't mean that you're good or bad with money. It just means that hopefully you'll learn from your mistake and then, keep going and keep learning.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful. And I think it does come down to that, is knowing your own money story, knowing your motivation, knowing where you're going. I think that's so important, and that your experiences all add up, and they influence how you make other decisions. Is your experience of saving and what savings means, because your parents, that goes into how you think about savings today, and maybe even into how much debt you take on, or everything else. So I think that's such a great point. So, Julie, this is probably the most important question. Where can people learn more about you and pick up their very own copy of Growing Wealth?
Well, right now it's available on Amazon. I've got an ebook out and a paperback book. And really, you can learn a lot about me through the book. So if you want to know more about me and gardening and my money story, you can find it there. And then I've also have a website, juliereigns.com, that I'll invite you to visit as well.
Fantastic. And for everybody watching and listening, like always, there'll be links to Julie's books and to her website in the show notes. Julie, thank you so much. I'm having a tough time with those words. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for tuning in to the Tony Steuer Podcast. Until next time.